Months after Judge Richard Hargrove's removal from the bench, life in Ridgewood began to shift in subtle yet meaningful ways. The once dreaded courthouse no longer felt like a place where justice was meted out unequally. New policies were implemented. Judges now underwent mandatory bias training, and an independent oversight board was established to review complaints from defendants. These changes didn't happen overnight, but they signaled a turning point, a community beginning to confront its flaws head-on. For Maya Carter, the journey had been transformative. What started as a frustrating traffic ticket had evolved into a nationwide movement for accountability and reform. Her name became synonymous with courage and resilience, inspiring countless individuals to speak up against injustice. People from all walks of life reached out to thank her, some sharing their own stories of discrimination, others expressing gratitude for giving them hope that change was possible. But Maya wasn't content to rest on her laurels. She continued to use her platform to advocate for broader systemic reforms, traveling across the country to speak at conferences, universities, and community events. Her speeches always ended with the same message: justice isn't just about punishing wrongdoing. It's about creating a society where everyone feels seen, heard, and valued. Those words resonated deeply, sparking conversations far beyond the walls of courtrooms. In Ridgewood, the ripple effects of Maya's actions extended beyond policy changes. Community members came together to form organizations aimed at educating residents about their rights within the legal system. Schools introduced programs teaching students about civic responsibility and the importance of standing up for fairness. Even local businesses got involved, sponsoring workshops and hosting fundraisers to support initiatives focused on equality and justice. As for Judge Hargrove, his fall from grace served as a cautionary tale. Once a powerful figure in the town, he now lived quietly on the outskirts, largely forgotten by those who once feared him. Occasionally, news outlets would revisit his case as part of larger discussions about judicial accountability, reminding the public of the dangers of unchecked prejudice. His story became a lesson, not just about personal failure, but about the need for vigilance and holding institutions accountable. Back in her role as a federal prosecutor, Maya noticed a shift in how people interacted with her. Colleagues who had previously underestimated her now approached her with respect and admiration. Strangers recognized her in public places, often stopping to express their gratitude or simply to shake her hand. But despite the accolades, Maya remained grounded. She knew the fight for justice was far bigger than any one person, and that real progress required collective effort. One evening, as she sat on her apartment balcony watching the sunset, Maya reflected on everything that had transpired. The road ahead was still long, filled with challenges and obstacles she couldn't yet foresee. Yet, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment knowing she had made a difference, even if it was just one step toward a more equitable world. Her phone buzzed beside her, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from a young law student who had attended one of her recent talks. Thank you for showing me what it means to stand up for what's right. You've inspired me to pursue justice without fear. Smiling softly, Maya set the phone down and leaned back in her chair. In that moment, she realized her legacy wasn't defined by headlines or awards. It was defined by the lives she touched and the seeds of change she planted along the way. And so, Maya Carter moved forward, not as a symbol of perfection, but as a testament to the power of perseverance. She proved that even in the face of adversity, one voice could spark a movement, and one movement could inspire a generation. Justice, she believed, wasn't something you achieved alone. It was something you built together, brick by brick, until the foundation stood strong enough to hold everyone equally. Maya knew that exposing Judge Hargrove's bias was only the first step. Real change required action. Concrete, measurable steps to address the systemic issues plaguing the justice system. With the support of advocacy groups and legal experts, she filed a formal complaint against him with the State Judicial Conduct Board, citing his actions as evidence of systemic racism. The document was thorough, detailing not only her own experience, but also patterns of discriminatory behavior uncovered during the investigation. The complaint sparked a wave of similar filings from others who had endured unfair treatment in Judge Hargrove's courtroom. A young mother recounted how he had fined her exorbitantly for a minor parking violation, leaving her struggling to make ends meet. A college student described being mocked by the judge when explaining that he couldn't afford legal representation. Each story added weight to the growing case against him, painting a clear picture of a man unfit to serve on the bench. Under mounting pressure, the Judicial Conduct Board launched a full-scale investigation. Investigators pored over years' worth of court transcripts, reviewed video footage of hearings, and interviewed dozens of witnesses, including former clerks, attorneys, and defendants. What they uncovered was damning. Consistent patterns of racial bias, dismissive treatment of marginalized individuals, and a blatant disregard for due process. As the investigation unfolded, public outrage showed no signs of waning. Community leaders organized rallies outside the courthouse, demanding accountability not just for Judge Hargrove, but for all judges who abused their power. Protesters carried signs reading *Fair Courts == justice*, and chanted slogans like "No more bias." Local schools invited Maya to speak to students about civic responsibility and standing up against injustice, inspiring a new generation to believe in the possibility of change. Amidst the chaos, Maya worked tirelessly behind the scenes to push for broader reforms. She collaborated with lawmakers to draft legislation requiring mandatory implicit bias training for all judges and law enforcement officers. She advocated for the creation of independent oversight boards tasked with reviewing judicial decisions and addressing complaints from the public. And she championed efforts to increase diversity within the judiciary, arguing that representation mattered when it came to trust and fairness. Her work didn't go unnoticed. National media outlets began profiling her as a leading voice in the fight for judicial reform. One magazine even featured her on its cover with the headline, Maya Carter, the prosecutor who took on bias. While some praised her courage, others questioned whether she was biting off more than she could chew. Critics accused her of grandstanding, claiming she was using her personal grievance to further her career. But Maya brushed off the negativity, knowing that true progress often came at a cost. Months later, the Judicial Conduct Board released its findings. The report confirmed what many had suspected. Judge Richard Hargrove had engaged in repeated acts of misconduct rooted in racial bias, citing a pattern of prejudiced behavior incompatible with the principles of justice. The board voted unanimously to remove him from the bench permanently. The decision sent shockwaves through Ridgewood and beyond, serving as a stark reminder that no one, not even a sitting judge, was above accountability. For Maya, the victory was bittersweet. Removing one biased judge wouldn't dismantle the entire system overnight. There were still countless others operating under the same flawed structures, perpetuating the same injustices. But she allowed herself a moment of quiet pride, knowing that this was a significant step forward, a crack in the foundation of inequality that might widen into something greater with time. As she stood outside the courthouse on the day of the verdict, surrounded by cheering supporters, Maya felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't the end of her fight. It was merely the beginning. Armed with resilience and hope, she vowed to keep pushing until the scales of justice tipped evenly for everyone. In the weeks following the incident, Judge Richard Hargrove found himself under an unrelenting spotlight. The once authoritative figure now appeared defensive and uneasy as reporters camped outside his home and news outlets dissected his every past decision. Desperate to salvage his reputation, he released a carefully worded public statement, insisting that he hadn't recognized Maya's credentials during the hearing, and that his ruling was based solely on the facts of the case. "I treat everyone equally in my courtroom," he declared, though his tone lacked conviction. But the public wasn't buying it. Leaked documents and testimonies from former court clerks painted a damning picture of his conduct over the years. One clerk revealed how Judge Hargrove would often mutter derogatory remarks under his breath when certain defendants approached the bench. Another recounted how he dismissed evidence presented by people of color without giving them a fair chance to speak. These revelations only fueled the growing calls for accountability. Meanwhile, Maya spent hours reflecting on the situation. While part of her felt vindicated by the attention her case had brought to systemic injustice, another part wrestled with frustration. Why did it take someone like her, a federal prosecutor with undeniable credibility, to expose these biases? What about the countless others who didn't have her platform or resources? It was a sobering reminder of just how deeply ingrained prejudice was in the system she worked so hard to uphold. Determined to turn this moment into something constructive, Maya began collaborating with advocacy groups and legal experts to push for reforms. She gave interviews, wrote op-eds, and even testified before state lawmakers about the need for greater transparency in judicial processes. Her message was simple yet powerful. Justice shouldn't depend on who you are or what you look like. "I'm not here to villainize anyone," she said during one televised panel discussion. "What I want is for us to acknowledge the flaws in our system and work together to fix them. Accountability isn't punishment, it's progress." Her words resonated widely, inspiring grassroots movements across the country. In Ridgewood, local activists organized town hall meetings where residents could share their own experiences with bias in the courts. Many spoke of feeling dismissed, belittled, or outright ignored by judges and attorneys. Others shared stories of loved ones who had been unfairly sentenced or fined. Each story added fuel to the fire, pushing more people to demand change. Judge Hargrove, sensing the tide turning against him, attempted to defend his record during a live interview, but his answers came across as rehearsed and insincere. When pressed about specific cases, he grew visibly flustered, stammering through vague explanations. By the end of the segment, social media was ablaze with memes mocking his performance, further eroding whatever credibility he had left. As the investigation into his conduct intensified, Judge Hargrove was temporarily suspended from hearing cases. For many, this felt like a small victory, but Maya knew it wasn't enough. Suspension wouldn't dismantle the systemic issues at play. Real change required deeper action. Mandatory implicit bias training for all judges, independent oversight boards to review judicial decisions, and increased diversity within the judiciary itself. Late one evening, sitting at her kitchen table surrounded by notes and drafts of proposed policy changes, Maya allowed herself a rare moment of quiet reflection. She thought about the young girl she used to be, the bright-eyed teenager who dreamed of becoming a lawyer because she believed in fairness and equality. Back then, she never imagined she'd face discrimination in the very halls of justice she sought to serve. Yet here she was, standing at the center of a movement she hadn't planned to lead but couldn't walk away from. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be resistance, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But Maya reminded herself why she started this journey in the first place. Justice wasn't just a concept, it was a promise. And she intended to keep fighting until that promise was fulfilled for everyone, no matter their race, background, or circumstances. By the time Maya stepped outside the courthouse, word of what had happened inside was already spreading like wildfire. A young law student who had been observing the proceedings quickly posted about the incident on social media, describing how Judge Hargrove had dismissed a federal prosecutor's arguments only to later discover her identity. Within hours, the story went viral, sparking outrage and curiosity across legal circles and beyond. Local news outlets picked up the thread, airing segments that highlighted not only Maya's experience, but also Judge Hargrove's troubling history of biased rulings. Reporters dug into public records, uncovering patterns of disproportionate fines and harsh sentences handed down to defendants of color in his courtroom. One particularly damning report featured interviews with former defendants who recounted feeling humiliated and powerless under his gavel. "He didn't even look at me when he sentenced me," said one man, his voice trembling with emotion. "It was like I wasn't human." The backlash grew louder as community leaders joined the conversation. Activist groups organized protests outside the courthouse, holding signs that read *Justice for All," Not just some asterisk, and asterisk bias has no place in court. Asterisk social media exploded with hashtags like #FairCourtsNo and #StandWithMaya, drawing attention from people far beyond Ridgewood. Even national figures began weighing in, calling for an investigation into Judge Hargrove's conduct. For Maya, the sudden spotlight was both overwhelming and empowering. Friends, colleagues, and strangers reached out to express their support, praising her courage for standing up to such blatant prejudice. But she knew this wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever walked into a courtroom and felt unseen or unheard because of their race, gender, or background. Determined to keep the momentum going, Maya agreed to speak at a press conference organized by local advocates. Standing behind a podium surrounded by microphones, Maya addressed the crowd with the same calm confidence she'd shown in the courtroom. "What happened to me isn't unique," she began, her voice steady yet impassioned. "Every day, countless individuals face similar injustices, often without the resources or platform to fight back. We can't ignore these systemic issues any longer. It's time to hold our institutions accountable and demand real change." Her words resonated deeply, earning applause from the audience gathered in front of her and thousands more watching online. News anchors replayed clips of her speech throughout the day, framing her not just as a victim of bias, but as a symbol of resilience and advocacy. Meanwhile, pressure mounted on Judge Hargrove. Calls for his removal intensified, with petitions circulating online demanding his immediate suspension. Members of the State Judicial Conduct Board announced they would launch a formal investigation into his behavior, citing mounting evidence of misconduct. Local officials, eager to distance themselves from the controversy, publicly condemned his actions, urging transparency and reform. Despite the growing storm around him, Judge Hargrove remained largely silent, issuing a brief statement through his attorney, claiming he hadn't recognized Maya's credentials during the hearing. The explanation did little to quell the outrage. Critics pointed out that recognition shouldn't matter. A fair judge should treat everyone equally, regardless of who they are. As days turned into weeks, the ripple effects of Maya's confrontation continued to grow. Legal professionals across the country started discussions about implicit bias training for judges and attorneys. Community organizations partnered with schools to educate young people about their rights within the justice system. And in Ridgewood itself, residents found new hope that perhaps this moment could spark meaningful change. For Maya, it was clear that the fight was far from over. But as she scrolled through messages of gratitude and solidarity late one night, she allowed herself a small smile. What had begun as a frustrating traffic ticket had evolved into something much bigger, a movement toward accountability, fairness, and justice for all. As Maya turned to leave the courtroom, a strange sensation washed over her, a mix of disbelief, frustration, and quiet determination. She had followed the rules, presented her case respectfully, and yet justice hadn't been served. Instead, she'd been dismissed with a hefty fine, as though her words carried no weight at all. But something inside her refused to let it end there. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about challenging the unfairness that so many others faced every day. Before she could take another step, Judge Hargrove's voice rang out across the room, stopping her in her tracks. "Miss Carter," he called, his tone slightly less sharp than before, but still tinged with impatience. "Do you have anything else to say before you go?" Maya paused, her hand resting on the railing of the witness stand. For a moment, she considered walking away without another word. After all, what good would speaking up do now? The judge had already made up his mind. But then she thought about the people sitting behind her. The young Hispanic man fined for jaywalking, the elderly black woman scolded for an unleashed dog, and countless others who likely left this courtroom feeling powerless and unseen. If she didn't speak now, when would she? Slowly, Maya turned back toward the bench. Her expression remained calm, but there was a new intensity in her eyes, an unshakable resolve that demanded attention. Stepping forward, she looked directly at Judge Hargrove and said, "Actually, Your Honor, yes. There is something I'd like to clarify. The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by her response. Go on, he said cautiously, leaning slightly forward in his chair. Taking a deep breath, Maya began. Your Honor, my name is Assistant U.S. Attorney Maya Carter. I serve as a federal prosecutor in the Southern District of State. The words hung in the air for a moment, heavy with meaning. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as those around her processed what she had just said. Even Judge Hargrove froze, his pen hovering midair above the paperwork in front of him. For several seconds, the room was utterly silent. All eyes were on the judge, waiting to see how he would react. His face flushed red, whether from embarrassment or anger, it was hard to tell. Finally, he cleared his throat and stammered. I didn't realize. His voice trailed off, unsure of how to finish the sentence. Maya didn't wait for him to recover. Keeping her tone measured but firm, she continued, I understand that mistakes can happen, Your Honor. But dismissing someone's argument without considering the evidence, or worse, assuming their guilt based on preconceived notions, isn't just unfair. It undermines the very foundation of our justice system. She let her words sink in, watching as the judge shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as spectators exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement while others whispered in shock. One older woman seated near the back gave Maya a small, approving smile. A young man in a hoodie leaned over to his friend and muttered, She's not backing down. That's impressive. Judge Hargrove, however, seemed unable to respond. His earlier arrogance had vanished, replaced by an awkward tension that filled the room. Sensing that she'd made her point, Maya took a step back. Thank you for your time, Your Honor, she said simply, her voice steady. Then, turning on her heel, she walked out of the courtroom with her head held high. As the doors swung shut behind her, Maya exhaled deeply, allowing herself a brief moment of relief. She knew this wasn't the end of the battle, not by a long shot. But she also knew she had planted a seed. Sometimes, exposing injustice required more than arguments and evidence. Sometimes, it required standing tall and showing the world exactly who you are. And Maya Carter had done just that. When Maya stepped up to the bench, she felt the weight of Judge Hargrove's gaze settle on her. It wasn't a curious or thoughtful look. It was dismissive, as though he had already decided what kind of person she was before she even opened her mouth. The courtroom fell silent, save for the faint creak of the wooden floor beneath her heels. She squared her shoulders, refusing to let his demeanor intimidate her. Your Honor, Maya began, her voice steady and clear. I appreciate your time today, but I believe there has been a misunderstanding regarding the citation. She paused briefly, meeting his eyes with unwavering confidence. According to the officer who issued the ticket, I was allegedly speeding earlier this morning. However, I can provide proof that I wasn't driving at all during the time in question. She reached into her bag and pulled out a neatly printed document, a court schedule detailing her appearance in federal court that very morning. Holding it up for the judge to see, she continued, As you can see, I was handling official duties as a federal prosecutor throughout the period when the alleged offense occurred. There's simply no way I could have committed the violation. Judge Hargrove barely glanced at the paper, waving it off as if it were irrelevant. His lips pressed into a thin line, and his tone carried an edge of irritation. Miss Carter, officers don't issue tickets without reason. Are you suggesting that law enforcement is mistaken, or worse, lying? Maya kept her composure, though she could feel her frustration simmering just below the surface. No, Your Honor, I'm not questioning their integrity. What I'm saying is that mistakes happen, and in this case, the evidence supports my side of the story. If needed, I can also provide testimony from colleagues who were present with me that morning. The judge leaned back in his chair, narrowing his eyes at her. For a moment, he said nothing, letting the silence stretch uncomfortably. Then, without warning, his expression hardened further. You seem awfully sure of yourself, young lady, but arrogance won't get you far here. Do you understand that? Maya blinked, taken aback by the sudden shift in tone. Arrogance. She hadn't raised her voice or shown anything close to disrespect, yet here he was, twisting her calm explanations into something they weren't. Still, she refused to let his words rattle her. Instead, she responded with measured patience. "Your Honor, I assure you, I have no intention of being disrespectful. My goal is simply to present the facts so we can resolve this matter fairly." But Judge Hargrove wasn't listening anymore. He cut her off mid-sentence, his voice sharp and final. "Enough. This court doesn't have time for drawn-out arguments over minor infractions. You've admitted to owning the vehicle in question, and that's sufficient grounds for accountability." With a swift motion, he grabbed his gavel and brought it down with a resounding crack. "Fine. $500. Next case." The room seemed to freeze. Maya stood there, stunned, as the bailiff called the next defendant to approach the bench. Her mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. How could he dismiss her so easily, ignoring the evidence she presented? It was as if nothing she said mattered, not her profession, not her character, not even the truth. For a brief moment, anger flared inside her. She wanted to argue, to demand that he listen. But then she caught herself. Yelling or losing her temper wouldn't help. It would only reinforce the stereotypes he likely already held about her. Taking a deep breath, she steadied herself, her thoughts turning inward. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. As she turned to leave the courtroom, she realized something important. Sometimes, justice didn't come from within the system. Sometimes, it had to be fought for outside of it. And Maya Carter was ready to fight. The day of the court hearing arrived, and Maya stepped into the Ridgewood County Courthouse with a quiet confidence. She had dressed professionally, wearing a crisp navy blue blazer over a white blouse, her posture straight, and her expression calm. To anyone watching, she looked like someone who belonged in this setting, someone accustomed to navigating the intricacies of the law. But as she entered the courtroom, she couldn't ignore the weight of the stares that followed her. The room was small but crowded, filled with people waiting for their cases to be called. Some sat slumped in their chairs, looking defeated, while others whispered nervously to family members or friends beside them. The air smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood, and the low hum of murmured conversations created an uneasy atmosphere. At the front of the room sat Judge Richard Hargrove, a man in his late 50s with thinning gray hair and a perpetually stern expression. His reputation preceded him. Locals often described him as harsh, impatient, and quick to pass judgment, especially when it came to defendants of color. Maya took a seat near the back, observing the proceedings unfold before her case was called. One by one, individuals approached the bench, each hoping for leniency, but rarely receiving it. A young Hispanic man was fined heavily for jaywalking, despite explaining that he'd crossed the street to help a child retrieve a lost ball. An elderly black woman received a scolding lecture from Judge Hargrove after being cited for failing to leash her dog properly, even though the animal hadn't caused any harm. Meanwhile, a white teenager accused of littering walked away with nothing more than a warning and a curt "don't let it happen again." Each ruling seemed to reinforce what Maya already suspected. This judge operated with bias, doling out punishments based not on fairness, but on personal prejudices. Her heart sank as she watched these injustices play out, knowing full well that she might soon find herself on the receiving end of his harshness. Still, she reminded herself to stay focused. This wasn't just about her. It was about standing up against a system that allowed such blatant discrimination to persist. As the minutes ticked by, Maya noticed something else about Judge Hargrove. He barely looked at the defendant standing before him, instead shuffling through papers with disinterest. When he did speak, his words were sharp and dismissive, cutting off anyone who tried to explain their side of the story. It was clear he had already made up his mind about most cases before they were even presented. When the bailiff finally called her name, Maya rose slowly from her seat, smoothing her blazer as she stepped forward. Every eye in the room turned toward her, some curious, others indifferent. As she stood before the bench, She felt the familiar sting of judgment, the kind that came not from evidence but from assumptions. Judge Hargrove glanced at her briefly, then returned his attention to the ticket in front of him, his pen poised to scribble notes. For a moment, Maya hesitated. She could feel the tension in the room, the unspoken weight of expectation hanging heavy in the air. But she pushed aside her nerves, reminding herself why she was here. This wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about proving that everyone deserved to be treated fairly, regardless of their background. Taking a deep breath, she prepared to face whatever came next, determined to hold her ground no matter how daunting the challenge ahead. The sun was setting over the quiet town of Ridgewood, casting a warm orange glow across the streets. Maya Carter, a sharp and confident young woman in her early 30s, gripped the steering wheel of her car as she drove home after a long day at work. Her mind was still buzzing with thoughts about an upcoming case she was handling as a federal prosecutor. It wasn't until she noticed flashing blue lights behind her that her focus shifted. Maya glanced at her rearview mirror and sighed softly. She hadn't been speeding. She was sure of it, but there was no point in arguing with what felt like yet another routine traffic stop. Pulling over to the side of the road, she rolled down her window and waited patiently for the officer to approach. As the officer walked up, his flashlight beam swept across her face before settling on her license plate. "Good evening, ma'am," he said, his tone polite but distant. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Maya shook her head slightly, keeping her voice calm and respectful. "No, sir, I don't believe I was doing anything wrong." The officer leaned closer, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. He asked for her driver's license and registration, which Maya handed over without hesitation. She had nothing to hide, but something about the way he looked at her made her feel uneasy. It wasn't the first time she'd experienced this kind of scrutiny simply because of the color of her skin. Still, she reminded herself to stay composed. After running her information through his system, the officer returned to her car. Instead of handing back her documents, he began asking questions that seemed unrelated to the supposed traffic violation. Where was she coming from? Where was she headed? Did she live nearby? Maya answered each question politely, though she couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter wasn't going to end quickly. Finally, the officer handed her a ticket, explaining that she'd been reported for speeding earlier that morning by another patrol unit. Maya frowned. "But officer," she said gently, "I've been in court all day. I haven't even driven this route until now." He didn't seem interested in hearing her explanation. With a curt nod, he told her she'd need to appear in court later that week to resolve the issue. Maya accepted the ticket reluctantly, knowing that arguing wouldn't help. But as she drove away, frustration bubbled inside her. This wasn't just about a ticket. It was about how people like her were often treated unfairly, judged not by their actions but by preconceived notions. As she parked outside her apartment building, Maya sat in silence for a moment, staring at the ticket in her hand. She knew the system well enough to understand that these kinds of situations could easily spiral into bigger problems if not handled carefully. And while she had every intention of clearing her name, little did she know that this seemingly minor incident would set off a chain of events that would challenge not only her patience, but also expose deep flaws in the very system she worked so hard to uphold. With determination burning in her chest, Maya resolved to face whatever came next head-on. After all, she was no stranger to standing up for justice, even when it meant fighting battles she never expected to fight.